All right, good morning, everybody. Can you hear me well? Everywhere in the room? If not, raise your hand. Are we okay? Okay, good. My name is Rik Peels, and welcome to this replication workshop. I'm excited and glad that we, as I feel it, finally have it after more than a year of preparation. And I'm excited particularly because this workshop brings together art historians, theologians, scholars in the science and religion debate, people working on replication or thinking about replication, philosophers, and people from numerous other disciplines. And as I've just had this conversation with someone over coffee, interdisciplinarity is a big thing. It's a buzzword, but it's also a really hard thing in reality. And we might experience some of that today. And yet once it works, it can have tremendous and surprising results. So again, welcome to this workshop. I'm glad we're having it. A few comments by way of introduction. You might have noticed it's a hybrid meeting, so there are a couple of people at home watching online. And in the Q&A, we will seek to alternate between questions from people in the room and from people at home. Second, all the talks will be recorded and shared on the website of the Kuyper Center, and thereby also on YouTube. The Q&As will not, so they won't be recorded. So there's plenty of room for open, critical, if you like, and exploratory discussion. So don't feel limited in any sort of way when you reply to any of the presentations. It's a tryout event, so feel free to say whatever you like within the limits of morality. And let me answer that the speakers also have an opportunity to have a look at the recording before it goes online, if they would like to do so. Third point, if you've got any trouble with the payment, for those few people who need to pay, contact Daniel. Where's Daniel? Is Daniel still around? Daniel's right there at the back. For dinner, I think we're good largely, but if you have any special dietary requirements that you have not communicated, again, please let Daniel know. Dinner is about a 15-minute walk from here, and we'll, I guess, jointly head there together after the workshop is ended. And finally, something about the structure of today's workshop. So it has a simple threefold structure. So we will start with the replication in science and religion, then the replication in art history, and then we'll have a more general discussion on the nature and possibilities and limits of replication in the humanities. That's basically the setup of today. All good so far? No urgent questions? All right. Then I would like to share a few thoughts with you myself on what I consider to be the opportunities and challenges for replication in the humanities. So first, a word on the replication crisis. So as we probably all know, the replication crisis started somewhere around 2011, 12, particularly in the biomedical and the social sciences. It's also called a trust crisis at times, whereupon attempts to replicate original work, so to do it again, it turned out that somewhere between 40 and in some cases 70 or 80% of studies turned out to have different results, or significantly different results. And of course that caused something of a stir within these fields. Economics would be another field. And ever since, replication has been an issue and has become in some fields the golden standard, they would call it, of true academic and solid work. And this, of course, applies so far to what you could call a post-prior work rather than a prior work. So not mathematics or logic or those fields, but fields in which we gather or collect data, in which we study contingent phenomena in the world that we collect. Now, there are various causes for the failure to replicate, and the one may be more prominent in one case than in the other. So there is, of course, fraud, falsification, and plagiarism. Fortunately, those are very, very rare. Let me emphasize that. Questionable research practices are also not as rare, but also rare. But of course, sometimes there are unhealthy publication systems or research systems with perverse publication incentives. But more important are such things as human error or changes in conditions and circumstances, sometimes just the lack of serious peer review or the lack of rigor. So various causes for this replication crisis. And of course, these fields have tried to improve things in the meanwhile. Now, what is the value of replication? And I think that's a legitimate question, because sometimes people say, well, why do the same thing again? And that reminded me of this what I consider to be terrific cover of a book on, the title is The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. And this is actually the cover of the book, right? So why do the same thing time and again? I think there's various values to successful replication. It can aid scientific progress because replicated results, one might think, are more likely to be true. Replicability prevents the waste of various resources, such as financial or time resources. If results are replicable, they are less likely to cause harm to individuals or society or nature. And of course, if too many results turn out not to be replicable, then they might gradually erode trust in science, but maybe also in academic scholarship, more generally, the humanities included. So a few years ago, there was an event in the Public Library of Amsterdam on replication and replicability, organized by the Royal Society of Science or Academic Scholarship in the Netherlands. And they had all the major fields represented, and at some point they thought to themselves, well, the humanities are lacking. So why don't we invite a humanities scholar? And they will probably argue that replicability is not a thing, nothing desirable in humanities. But they happened to invite me. So when I thought it through, that was the first time actually, I thought to myself, well, I see some worries, but I think there may be something to it. So I defended the possibility and desirability of replication in the humanities. And then we started to write a few more theoretical pieces. So considerations in favor of it, against it, and so on, particularly with Rex Bouter, the two of us. So that was kind of the theoretical branch of things. Then I thought to myself at some point, well, what is the more convincing argument for the possibility of replication than actually carrying out a replication? So that's why a few years ago we set out to do the 2 replication studies that will be presented today. And when I say we, I really mean people like Hans and Rachel and Charlotte, not so much me actually. So they've done the real work. And in the course of time, I've come to believe that it has some limitations, but also some wonderful opportunities and chances. And I would like to briefly present some of those before we delve into the specific replications. Before we start, a few words on the key terms here. So by humanities, I mean, I'm going to use an exemplary definition. Not for today, not going to enter a debate on the exact nature or the limits of the humanities, but fields like anthropology, archaeology, classics, history, linguistics, literary studies, philosophy, or parts of philosophy, the study of the arts and theology, right, to the extent that these are empirical. By replication study, I mean an independent repetition of an earlier study, answering the same research question by using the same or similar methods under the same or similar circumstances. I mean, definitions along these lines are quite widespread. And independence, there's very different kinds of independence. So partially independent authors, so at least partially new authors, but of course also independent of the original conclusions or findings. It shouldn't just assume anything along those lines. Now there is a distinction between replication and replicability. So the replication is carrying out a replication study, right? I'll get back to that. But replicability is the set of features that a study can have such that a replication is possible in the first place. So if a study is not replicable, that might be because the method is not described, or it's not clear how the data were collected in the first place, or maybe it's not clear what the research question even was. But in such cases, the study isn't even replicable in the first place, so you can't carry out a replication study. So I think it's helpful to keep those two apart, replicability, and if that condition is met, doing a replication study. A successful replication, bit of an ambiguous term, but you could say that is the case in which you carry out a replication study that leads to roughly the same or similar results. You could think, well, a replication study can still be successful, even if it leads to different results, because we learn a lot from it, right? And we'll see numerous examples of that. Degrees, so replicability and replication come in degrees. So successful replication can be more or less successful. Something can be more or less replicable in the first place. And finally, what I find helpful is to use this threefold distinction between a reproduction, a direct replication, and a conceptual replication. Where in the case of reproduction, you basically do the same thing again. So using the same, of course, the same research question, but also the same protocol, not a term we often use in the humanities, but basically the same setup, the same set of methods, using the same data. So reanalyzing what was done originally. A direct replication draws in new data. So that could be different bodies of text, or maybe a different part of the painting, or statues that were not considered. And the conceptual replication makes a change in the original study protocol. So it might use a new method or extend an existing method, something along those lines. So a paradigmatic replication is one with the same researchers, so that they can shed light on how the original researcher was carried out, but also new researchers that can hopefully avoid the activation of certain biases, jointly see that. New data, the original study protocol with the original question, and then it also explains, if possible, the similarities and differences between the original study and the replication study. All right. Now, is replication possible in the humanities? I think there are two kinds of arguments or reasons or considerations in favor of this idea. The first one is something like an a priori, or purely conceptual one, if you like. And then the basic idea is, well, if you get what replication is, namely answering an original research question, using maybe the same method or a similar method, using the same data or slightly new data, and you get what the humanities do, in virtue of what humanities are, namely research objects that have meaning and value, things like statues and paintings and bodies of text, collect data about them, try to understand them, then it just follows that replication is possible. Because of course we could answer the same research question again by reanalyzing those original data, by asking questions like how were those data collected, is the conclusion justified in light of those data, what were the background assumptions? Of course we can do that. So it just follows. You don't even need to consider specific cases of studies in the humanities to see that. Maybe not all varieties of replication, maybe not in all cases of studies in the humanities, but in some cases, yes, it just follows straight away. But for those among us slightly more skeptical, there's also what you could call an a posteriori argument. So that is an argument on the basis of looking at specific cases. So I will mention three cases here of studies already existing in the humanities. And those are not formal replication studies, but they resemble replication to some extent. And I think it should be clear that you can easily formalize them and turn them into systematic replications. So take the idea that Augustine was influenced by Gnosticism. That is a core idea that it has been replicated time and again by scholars in theology, in patristics, in church history. And the idea is that he was influenced by it, but also departed from it, even though he remained to be influenced by it to some extent. And numerous scholars have looked at different bodies of text and confirmed this conclusion, although there's slight variations among them, of course. So there's something replication-like to that. It's not formally set up as one, but it could easily be. Or take the famous Rosetta Stone depicted here on the screen, where we have three languages, the Demotic, the Hieroglyphic, and the Ancient Greek, where, of course, the Hieroglyphic, the ancient Egyptian language, was not known to the audience at the time, but where they would use one language and then another language to decipher it. So you could, in principle, just use one language, see what it leads to, and then replicate it by using the other language and see whether it leads to the same or similar or different results. So again, a study that is not a replication study, but that could easily be translated into one. And finally, painting, of course. So this was a painting found in an attic in Norway, and it turned out there was some reason to think that this might be a true Van Gogh. The painting is called Sunset in Montmajour, and after careful study, it was concluded, and I think it's pretty much established by now, correct me if I'm wrong, widely accepted, I thought, that this is indeed a true Van Gogh. And they use different methods to establish that, and they are to some extent relatively independent of one another. So you could look at Van Gogh's diaries, you could do a chemical analysis of the painting, you could look at the brush stroke, the colors, compare it to previous work, use like infrared analysis. There are numerous options that you can use, and various ones of which they did use. So again, here we see the same conclusion that they reached by way of different methods, very similar to a conceptual replication. So this, I think, provides a strong initial case, prima facie case, for the possibility of replication in humanities. However, there are, of course, some serious concerns about this idea, and some people have leveled those concerns in the literature. So let me just briefly summarize those and address a couple of them. I won't go in any detail here because we could do so later on today. Some people have said, well, the objects in the humanities are unique. There's only one sunset and Montmajour, whereas many objects in the sciences are such that there are numerous instances of them, like atoms or viruses, for instance. There are countless instances of them that you can study. There's a wide variety of methods in the humanities, just too many to make the idea of replication sensible. There's meaning beyond truth. So truth is not the only thing scholars in the humanities are concerned with, also meaning or intentionality or value. The fourth idea is that this is scientistic, so imperialistic from the natural sciences and the life and health sciences. So we use the methods from the sciences and turn them into something like a conditio sine qua non for all academic disciplines. Humans are interactive entities. They talk back, they change and respond once we investigate them. Positionality and connoisseurship, something like the positionality, the values, the experience, the skills of the scholar make a difference to the way his study is carried out and possibly also the conclusions it leads to. And finally, paradoxically, almost the opposite response, we are already doing this. So what's new? What's new about this? What value do we gain by just renaming these things? Right, so I can't address them all in detail, but just a couple. So the unicity objection, I think that's a bit of a red herring. So on the one hand, there are unique objects in the natural sciences as well, like the cosmos or space-time as a whole, or maybe the origin of life on Earth, which happened maybe only once. And on the other hand, you might say, well, in the humanities, we have objects of which there are numerous instances. So Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, published in 1917, is a particular case of novels written by her, or a particular case of novels using a stream of consciousness technique, right? So you could still compare it to other cases within those classes, and I believe it's a bit of a red herring because the issue is whether you can reanalyze original studies about, for instance, that book, or maybe draw in new data by having another careful look at that novel, or maybe even conceptual replication. So I think that first objection is not that solid. One I've often encountered as well is the meaning beyond truth issue. So there, my reply would be, yes, this is indeed a valid point and something we need to take seriously and be more sensitive towards than we often are in the natural sciences. Yet I would say, I mean, it leaves some studies perfectly fine. For instance, is this a true Van Gogh, right? The issue of meaning and value is less prevalent there. But of course, it's big when it comes to text, and there are different ways one can go there. So one way to go would be to say, well, there are different kinds of meanings. There is, for instance, the author intentional meaning, so what the author had in mind. There is the meaning of words, sentences, and bodies of texts in a particular country or region in a particular time. Like English words or Dutch words have a particular meaning, right, independent of what I think the meaning is at a particular time. So you could try to establish those meanings. And one final thought is that even if there are numerous meanings or several meanings that are equally sound or equally plausible, it's still the case that some meanings are implausible that we can rule out, for instance, right? And if that's the case, then replication studies can do at least that. So that leaves us with the case in which there are equally sound meanings to a particular text or a body of text. And I think there's more to be said about what happens in those cases. Maybe it's ambiguity, not so much out there in the text, but in us. Maybe we don't have enough evidence to settle on a particular meaning. So maybe we should suspend judgment and say, well, here's one meaning that is sound in light of the text, and here's another meaning that is equally sound, and just make slightly more modest conclusions in light of that fact. Let me see, we're already doing this. That's maybe another interesting one. I think that is right to some extent. And yet I believe that carrying out formal systematic replication studies adds something. So one example of that is the pre-registration phenomenon. That is not common at all yet in the humanities. So that's what we did for the 3 replication studies, or 2, depending on how you define it, in our project. So what we did is pre-register carefully in advance exactly what the research question was, what the method was in the original study and the new study, and so on. And also for ourselves, think through potential biases that might be activated in the original research and in our own. And I think that whole process of pre-registration has been tremendously helpful in better understanding the original study and better navigating how we set up the new study. So there's tremendous value in doing it as a formal replication study, even though something similar is often already being done in the humanities. All right, final slide for my introduction, almost there. So then what is the value specifically of replication in the humanities? Can we say something general about that? I think there are a couple of things we can say, and maybe it's helpful to divide them into two. On the one hand, there's the value of potentially increasing the trustworthiness of original findings. So if it's the case that there's a finding and we successfully replicate that, particularly if we conceptually replicate it, then we can increase our trust in the original findings. And that's good for trust building. We should think about what exactly follows if we don't successfully replicate upon an attempt to do so. Maybe because it's insight into how to better do things, right? So there's still value in that. But I wouldn't say like if you don't successfully replicate, then discard the original study or nothing close to that. But so on the other hand, there is much value in the process of replication, even apart from the original findings or the trustworthiness of the original findings. And a couple of things I'd like to mention here are insight into the method and protocol. So we've had numerous conversations with the original authors for these replication studies, trying to get a better grip on how the study was set up or how particular sources were selected. And that can be a challenge. So I remember Professor John Brooke sharing at some point. So I asked him, like, how did you select these sources? And part of the answer was, well, I just read anything in the science and religion literature that I could lay my hands on for 20 years. Right? And I thought, okay, how are we going to replicate that? Right? So it raises some serious issues. There's background assumptions and paradigms, particularly in humanities, there are schools, but so of course there are in the social sciences and economics. What is the role of those? So it stimulates reflection on that. I think it increases transparency for future studies, right? So gives us a much better handle on how studies are set up and also to see where we disagree. And I think it raises fascinating issues about things like connoisseurship, a big theme, of course, in art history, but also in other fields. And actually also in the sciences, like radiology, for instance. And it raises questions like, how should we construe this? Is this knowledge by acquaintance, Fingerspitzengefühl? To what extent can you train that? How important is that? What does it mean for the trustworthiness of the findings? So the basic point being there's the trustworthiness of the original findings, but I think there's a whole list, a gamut of other advantages that can potentially come with seeking to carry out replication studies in the humanities. Anyway, so that was a couple of general considerations and thoughts. And I think it's almost time to delve into the actual replication studies. But maybe there's a question. Yeah, I'll leave it to the moderator.
Okay, we may have time for a quick question. If there is one or two. Yeah, okay.
Say who we are before we ask the question?
That's wonderful, yeah.
Yeah.
Let me see your mic.
Oh. Yeah, no, it is. So I'm Maartje Stols. I'm involved in the replication studies around the Rembrandt situation. I had a question, Rik. You link pre-registration very clearly to replication, but for me it's more related to open science in general, pre-registration. Oh, right, yeah. So why do you make that as one of the sort of the values of replication?
Right. So of course you could just pre-register a study independently of any replication issue because it increases openness and transparency. So I would be all be in favor of that. Right. It's just that once you actually pre-register the study, replication becomes much easier, I would say. Right. So both when it comes to when there's a pre-registration of the original study and pre-registering the replication study, because it it pushes you to be way more careful and explicit about underlying assumptions, potential biases, and those sorts of things. Right. So, but yeah, but you could do so independently of replication. I fully agree. But the other way around is much harder to do replication without.
Yeah.
And if you don't do it formally, you'll have to go through those questions anyway. So there's in a sense, there's a link between the two, I would say.
Final question over there.
Oh, and maybe one more thing about these pre-registrations. What we also did is that we revised them along the way. I think two or three times so far. So it gives us not just insight into how the study was set up, but also insight into the thought process of the authors. And now that so much is digital, there's like almost no limits to what we can do.
Thank you. Jeremy Brown from the National Institutes of Health, I guess, in the United States. The reason that pre-registration became so important in the sciences and my spaces in the clinical sciences is to address one specific problem, which is publication bias. That people would do studies, they'd be negative studies, they put them in the drawer and nobody would know about them until they repeated the study and fortuitously perhaps they got a positive result and that would then be published, but nobody would know there's one positive finding, one negative finding. Journals don't like to publish negative findings, they're not thought to be important, although that's changing. So what role is there, or better, how common is the a publication bias in the humanities? I mean, we can all speak to our own particular area, but how common do we do some research in the humanities, come up with a finding and say, no, that's not really what I was looking for, and put it in the drawer, as opposed to we do our research, we find something and that is still published. I think there are just two sort of slightly different things we think about in each area.
Right. I mean, even in the sciences nowadays, there are journals where you just submit the protocol, right, independently of the findings, and it's accepted or not. And then if it's a negative finding, then that's equally fine, right? So maybe we should pursue something along those lines in humanities as well for some journals, but just submit the methodology and so on independently of the findings. And when the findings are negative or not particularly interesting, still publish it. So I would be in favor of that, actually. Yeah, it's hard to estimate how much of a problem this is in the humanities, and it might differ drastically even between, I don't know, historiography and musicology, for instance. I could only say something about philosophy and a little bit about theology, maybe.
Right, but just to take the example of the arts, right? A finding that a painting is by Rembrandt is just as important as a finding that a painting is not by Rembrandt, right? So both, one would be a positive finding, one would be a negative finding, both would be very interesting. But the finding that a particular kind of drug does not work, well, that's important for the people behind the drug, the manufacturers. Right. But other than that, those studies don't come out. So I just think we have to, when we think about the sciences as the sort of paradigm, I think we're going to discover during the day that that's harder and harder to do for a number of reasons. Right.
Yeah. I don't think of the sciences as the paradigm. No. So I've written about scientism, and I'm not a fan of it at all. That being said, though, I believe that there is something that the humanities can learn from the sciences when it comes to replication. And I hope, and I think this is actually the case, that in the future, the sciences can equally learn from the humanities when it comes to replication. So the basic idea being is that the humanities are sometimes better equipped to think about things like background assumptions, schools, paradigms, positionality of the scholar, connoisseurship. So my hope is that they will study that in detail and then feed that back. There's a feedback loop back to the science.